Children. Expensive, right? Even in the wealthiest families on the most developed, civilized, and privileged worlds of the Imperium, they are expensive and often troublesome. Not just financially, of course, that's just the beginning. There's also the demand on resources, time, energy, and attention. They need care, education, food, security. They need guidance, structure, discipline, and patience. Even in ideal conditions, raising a child is an ongoing investment. And when conditions are less than ideal, as is most often the case in the Imperium of Man, the challenges, understandably, multiply. So why have them? How does anyone have the enthusiasm, time, or energy to produce and raise them? How does humanity continue to exist, let alone grow into trillions upon trillions in number, in an environment where free time is largely non-existent and where resources for the average Joe Imperium are rationed or strained to a breaking point? Well, to start answering these questions, I think we should acknowledge that, at the most basic level, humans are wired to reproduce. The reproductive survival instinct doesn't disappear just because life is hard. In fact, it seems that quite often it is the exact opposite, where the harsher the conditions, the more populations grow. Look at developing nations. High infant mortality, political and economic instability coupled with a low life expectancy often leads to notably higher birth rates. In fact, in the second millennium on Terra, the top 10 countries with the fastest growing populations were all in sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Well, many reasons. Culture, education, tradition, but arguably more than anything, it was because when life is hard, when many family contributors are needed, when there is little outside support, and when survival isn't guaranteed, people instinctively hedge their bets by having more children. It's a harsh view, but it's an honest one. In such environments, children become extra hands in the workshop, more bodies in the field, future earners, caretakers, contributors, and eventual replacements. In societies where the future is uncertain, this strategy of familial redundancy becomes essential. When the system can't or won't look after you, and when institutional trust is non-existent, the family becomes the system. Now, let's apply this same logic to the Imperium. A single misstep in an Imperial manufactorum will lead to a painful death. A breath drawn at the wrong moment might flood the lungs with acidic toxins. A minor food riot can spiral into an Arbites-sanctioned purge, leaving thousands dead and many more cut off. Even a small clerical error by the Administratum can see entire workforces reassigned, made redundant, or simply erased from existence. The dangers facing the average Imperial citizen are countless, random, and ever-present. And yet, populations, namely hive populations, do not shrink. They swell, quite often into the trillions. Could it be that more children means more ration cards, a slightly larger hab unit, or a warmer corner near the heating vent? Maybe some planetary government official, half blind, overworked, and 10 years behind on his paperwork, decides to assign the last available hab unit to the family with 5 children, instead of the veteran labourer who served with distinction over 40 years in his manufactorum. Maybe the presence of child workers, small enough to crawl inside and repair broken machines, makes a family more valuable in the eyes of the foreman, their labour more immediately useful. Or maybe at the planet or district level, there are rewards and incentives that serve to drive up the birth rate. Governments calculating output not per individual, but per family unit. Performance reports that factor in generational productivity. The more bodies you provide, the more value your bloodline has to the system. Now, you might be thinking that all of this sounds quite strange, maybe even a bit too optimistic for something in the Imperium. And maybe you'd be right. This isn't a topic that has been explored in much depth, at least not in any sources that I can find, so we're largely left to extrapolate and make some informed assumptions in an attempt to explore and address this topic properly. However, if we at the very least acknowledge that it would be in the interests of any planetary government on a hive world to effectively grow or at least stabilize their world's birth rate, we might begin to see how creativity and innovative thinking could, albeit uncharacteristically, be employed, especially given the general distaste in the greater Imperium for less natural, equitable methods of reproduction. But when we boil it down, the fact remains that for planetary officials, any such programs and initiatives would not be about empathy or social equity. It's an economic calculation. Each child born is not to be seen as an individual, but as a future unit of labour. The logic behind the planetary government's push to increase the birth rate becomes brutally simple and easily justified. More children today means more workers tomorrow. But take all this speculation with a large grain of salt and reach your own conclusions. Anyway, beyond all this, we must also consider the tithe. The administratum couldn't care less about your struggles. It only cares for quotas. It demands bodies, and when a world fails to deliver, consequences follow. The Imperium is always at war, and wars need bodies. As such, it should be standard practice for fertility rates to be monitored, if not by the administratum, then by the planetary government, with the same urgency as industrial output. Birth rates being tracked, managed and incentivized. Every death must be replaced, every shortfall must be compensated, for tithe failures are not tolerated. So it doesn't matter if a family is struggling, time poor and starving. It doesn't matter if their living space is a rusted shipping crate or a damp sump level alcove. The pressure to reproduce will never end. The Imperium doesn't allow for stagnation. Well, maybe it does in many other areas, but not in this one. If a world can't meet demand through reproduction, other means will naturally be explored. Forced breeding programs, some variant of the frowned upon vitae wombs like those seen on Krieg, or simple, reliable off-world population imports. It doesn't matter how, quotas must and will be met. We also need to consider the religious demands to be expected in imperial life. Faith often encourages reproduction, even when it goes against reason or personal circumstance. Historically, religion has been one of the strongest drivers of high birth rates. Societies with deeply rooted religious institutions consistently promote larger families, framing childbirth as a sacred duty rather than a personal choice. In the case of the Imperial Creed, there is also limited information on this issue. However, as is outlined in Dark Heresy: Blood of the Martyrs, the Imperial Creed is a conglomeration of native religious practices. As such, practices adhered to on one world may be held as abhorrent on another, depending on its own combination of native, modified, and imported belief. The Ministorum tolerates a vast range of practice and belief. This surprising flexibility creates a somewhat diverse religious landscape across the Imperium and opens the door for us to make some more logical assumptions. It is therefore reasonable to assume that many interpretations of the Creed, at least in some Imperial worlds and systems, do place reproductive duty within a religious framework, where new life is seen as a gift from the Emperor and a reinforcement of his Imperium. To deny that offering would therefore be considered a form of spiritual disobedience. Reproduction as such becomes an act of loyalty, faith, and devotion, the creation of children becoming a sacred contribution to the Emperor's vision for a unified, dominant humanity. But sometimes the reasons aren't influenced by instinct, necessity, economics, law, or faith. Sometimes people have kids simply because they want to. Maybe it's because we want something to love, care for, and protect. Maybe it's because we want something to teach and guide with the lessons that we learnt ourselves. Or maybe it's because even in the most controlled, dehumanizing environments where identity is reduced to shifts and quotas, the impulse to build something beyond the immediate, to create something pure, still remains. In systems designed to consume everything, where freedom and individuality is stripped back and restrained, reproduction can become the only act that still feels like purpose or hope. These instincts are not new. They have historical precedent. Under the most brutal regimes of old Earth, when populations were starved, displaced, and erased, people still had children. The birth rates declined, yes, but they never disappeared. Because even when living through a nightmare, something in humans refuses to surrender the idea that a part of them might make it through. That maybe, just maybe, our children will see the light of true unification. Maybe they'll see the Emperor's dream fulfilled, and in that future, a part of us, however small and distant, will be there to see it. It's the idea that through your children, because they are of you, you are still contributing. That no matter your skills, your status, or the misery of your assignment, you have given something of great value to the species. It is hope. Hope that the world might one day be marginally less cruel to someone who carries your blood. It's hope that even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, some fragment of you might make it through and live long enough to see or build a better world. Anyway, thanks for watching. Dystopian Chimp out.